Move the artillery over that spot.
Over the fresh earth, Colonel. Are you certain?
I am. Drive on, immediately.
July 9th, 1755. The banks of the Monongahela River. The Ohio Country, present-day Braddock, Pennsylvania. The heat in the Ohio Valley was not merely a meteorological condition, it was a physical adversary, a suffocating blanket of humidity that trapped the stench of unwashed wool, horse sweat, and the acrid tang of fear. It was just past noon. The sun, suspended high above the ancient canopy of white oaks and maples, cast dappled, deceptive shadows onto the forest floor. Below the tree line, the world was a riot of scarlet and steel. Major General Edward Braddock's army, a serpentine column of 1 to 300 men, stretched for miles along a road they had hacked violently out of the wilderness. They were the King's regulars, the pride of the British Empire, disciplined men of the 44th and 48th Regiments of Foot. They marched in lockstep, their polished muskets gleaming, their drums beating a rhythm that was meant to intimidate the silence of the American frontier. Riding among them, dwarfed by the towering grandeur of the virgin forest, was a figure who did not fit the mold of the British officer class. George Washington was 23 years old, a colonel of the Virginia Regiment, serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp to General Braddock. He was a giant of a man for his time, standing nearly 6 feet 3 inches, with a frame that seemed carved from the very granite of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Yet, on this day, the giant was fragile. Washington was recovering from a violent bout of dysentery and fever, the bloody flux that plagued armies of the era. His face was gaunt, his eyes, usually a piercing gray-blue, were rimmed with the shadows of exhaustion. He had tied pillows to his saddle to dampen the agony of the horse's gait, refusing Braddock's order to stay behind in the medical wagons. He was driven by a relentless ambition and a desperate need to prove his worth to the British establishment. He wanted a royal commission. He wanted respect. He did not know he was riding toward a massacre that would dismantle his world. General Braddock, 60 years old and hardened by 45 years of service in the Coldstream Guards, rode a massive charger at the center of the column. Braddock was a man of geometry and discipline. He believed in the linear warfare of Europe, the open fields of Flanders where armies lined up like chess pieces and exchanged volleys until one side broke. He viewed the American wilderness not as a tactical environment, but as an obstruction to be cleared. "Savages may be formidable to your raw American militia," Braddock had famously scoffed to Benjamin Franklin months earlier. "But upon the King's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they should make any impression." Washington had tried to warn him. He knew the French and their indigenous allies did not fight with geometry. They fought with silence. They fought with the terrain. But Braddock had dismissed the young Virginian's counsel. The army had just crossed the Monongahela River for the second time that day, a maneuver executed with parade ground precision to avoid a narrow defile known as the Narrows. The mood in the ranks was lightening. They were only 7 miles from Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh, the French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio. The difficult march was nearly over. The band struck up the Grenadiers' March. The men, sweating in their heavy red coats, began to believe that the French would surrender without a fight, awed by the sheer spectacle of British power. But the forest was watching. Ahead of the main column, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage led the advance guard of 300 men into a wooded ravine. The road here narrowed, flanked by rising ground on the right and a steep drop to the river on the left. It was a natural choke point, thick with underbrush and fallen timber, a killing box in modern military parlance, though Gage saw it only as a shady respite from the sun. Washington, riding stiffly near the general, felt the hair on his arms stand up. The woods were too quiet. The cicadas had ceased their droning. The birds had vanished. Suddenly, a man stepped out from the trees directly in front of Gage's advance guard. He wore the hunting shirt of a French officer but carried himself with the fluid grace of a warrior. It was Captain Daniel Léonard de Beaujeu, the French commander. He stopped in the middle of the road, looked at the startled British column, and raised his hat high in the air. It was a signal. The response was instantaneous and terrifying. It did not begin with a visual assault, but an auditory one. From the ravines on either side of the British column, a sound erupted that froze the blood of the London-born regulars. It was the whoop and halloo, a high-pitched, ululating war cry from nearly 640 Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Huron warriors. To the soldiers, it sounded like the shrieking of demons. It was a psychological weapon, designed to shatter the nerve before a single shot was fired. Then came the fire. A sheet of flame erupted from the tree line. The British advance guard, trained to fire at visible targets, saw nothing but smoke and leaves. They fired a ragged volley into the trees, the balls thudding harmlessly into the oak trunks. The return fire was murderous. Officers, distinguished by their gorgets and sashes, fell instantly. Captain Beaujeu was killed in the first volley, a musket ball striking him dead, but his second-in-command, Captain Jean-Daniel Dumas, immediately signaled the warriors to flank the British column. The indigenous forces moved like ghosts, slipping down the ravines to encircle the redcoats in a half-moon formation. The British trap had snapped shut. The disintegration of the British column was not a gradual decline. It was a catastrophic structural failure. The advance guard, shattered by the initial volley and the terrifying flanking fire, fell back, but they did not retreat in order. Panic, contagious and primal, seized them. They turned and ran directly into the main body of the army which was advancing to support them. The road became a crush of bodies. Men pushing forward collided with men fleeing backward. Regimental cohesion dissolved. In the confusion, the British regulars began to fire wildly. They fired into the air. They fired into the ground. Tragically, they fired into the backs of their own comrades. General Braddock, enraged and disbelieving, rode into the chaos. His face, purple with exertion, was a mask of fury. He did not understand this war. He saw his men breaking formation, the cardinal sin of the British army, and he sought to discipline them into bravery. He struck his own soldiers with the flat of his sword, screaming at them to form, form. But you cannot form a line against an invisible enemy. The French and Indians were firing from behind cover, picking off the officers with chilling efficiency. Of the 86 officers present, 63 would be killed or wounded, a casualty rate of over 73%. Washington was in the thick of the maelstrom. With the other aides-de-camp, Captains Robert Orme and Roger Morris, wounded early in the fight, Washington was the only officer left to distribute Braddock's orders. He rode a fine stallion into the smoke, his tall figure a beacon for every marksman in the ravine. The air was thick with lead. Musket balls buzzed like angry hornets. They thwacked into the sides of the wagons, splintered the spokes of the artillery carriages, and tore through the soft flesh of men and horses. Washington felt a tug at his chest. He looked down. A hole, ragged and smoking, had appeared in the lapel of his coat. He had been hit, but there was no pain. The ball had passed through the fabric, missing his ribs by a fraction of an inch. He spurred his horse forward, trying to rally the Virginia provincials. Unlike the British regulars, the Virginians knew this kind of war. They broke ranks and took cover behind trees, attempting to return fire on the enemy's terms. But the British regulars, seeing muzzle flashes from the trees where the Virginians were hiding, mistook them for the enemy and fired into their backs, slaughtering their own allies. "Stop firing!" Washington shouted, waving his sword. But the roar of the musketry drowned him out. Suddenly, his horse jerked violently beneath him. A musket ball had struck the animal in the chest. It collapsed, blood spraying onto Washington's boots. He kicked his feet free of the stirrups with the reflexes of a master horseman, rolling in the dirt as the beast died. He scrambled to his feet, dust covering his blue uniform. He grabbed the reins of a riderless horse, a Chichaditi, terrified creature whose owner lay dead nearby. He swung himself into the saddle. He was back in the fight. 10 minutes later, it happened again. Another ball, another sickening impact. His second horse collapsed, shot out from under him. Washington stood up again. He brushed the dirt from his coat. He checked his body. Nothing. He found a third horse. He mounted it. A second bullet hole appeared in his coat, then a third, then a fourth. He was riding through a storm of death, yet he remained untouched. It was statistically impossible. Officers were falling all around him. Sir Peter Halket was dead. Braddock's secretary was dead. The road was a butcher's yard of screaming men and dying horses. And then the unthinkable happened. General Braddock, the invincible symbol of British might, was shouting an order when a musket ball slammed into his right arm, passed through the limb, and lodged deep in his lungs. The general reeled in the saddle. He toppled toward the earth. As Braddock hit the ground, the morale of the British Army shattered completely. The god of the expedition was mortal. The redcoats threw down their muskets. They abandoned the artillery. They abandoned the wagons. They abandoned the wounded. They ran. Washington looked at the chaotic mass of fleeing humanity. He looked at the dying general. He looked at the dark enclosing woods where the enemy whooped in triumph. He was the senior officer left on horseback. The fate of the survivors rested entirely on the shoulders of the 23-year-old Virginian. 41 years later, 1796, Germantown, Pennsylvania. We leave the blood-soaked mud of the Monongahela and travel forward 4 decades. The young colonel is now an old man. The wilderness has been tamed, a revolution has been won, and a nation has been forged. George Washington is 64 years old. He is the first president of the United States. He is the most famous man in the Western world, and he is in absolute, excruciating pain. The setting is a stone barn in Germantown, Pennsylvania, converted into a studio by the artist Gilbert Stuart. The air smells of linseed oil, turpentine, and the heavy powder of wigs. It is stiflingly hot. Washington sits in a red velvet chair. His face, once open and vigorous, is set in a grim mask of endurance. He hates this. He hates the sitting. He hates the vanity of it. He hates the loss of time. But most of all, he hates his mouth. To understand the portrait that would become the most famous image in history, one must understand the dental chamber of horrors that was George Washington's mouth. By the time he became president in 1789, Washington had only one natural tooth remaining, a lower left premolar. The rest had been lost to a lifetime of calomel, mercury oxide, treatments for malaria and smallpox, cracking walnuts with his teeth, and the general lack of hygiene of the 18th century. Now, in 1796, he was wearing a set of full dentures fabricated by his dentist, Dr. John Greenwood. Contrary to the popular schoolyard myth, they were not made of wood. Wood would have rotted and splintered in the saliva. The mechanism of these dentures was crude. They were held in place by coiled gold springs at the back of the jaw. These springs exerted a constant outward pressure, pushing the upper and lower plates apart. This meant that the dentures were always trying to pop Washington's mouth open. To keep his mouth closed, Washington had to actively clench his jaw muscles against the force of the springs. Every second of silence required physical exertion. If he relaxed, his mouth would snap open. This constant muscular tension caused the lower part of his face to bulge unnaturally, distorting the shape of his mouth and cheeks. "They are both uneasy in the mouth and bulge my lips out," Washington wrote in despair to Greenwood. Gilbert Stuart, the artist, stood behind his easel, a man of chaotic genius. He was a drinker, a debtor, and a brilliant conversationalist. He had returned to America from Britain with one specific goal: to paint Washington and make a fortune selling copies. But the president was a difficult subject. He sat like a stone. His jaw was clenched, his eyes were deadened by boredom and pain. Stuart tried to animate him. He talked of battles. Washington remained silent. He talked of politics. Washington scowled. Finally, Stuart mentioned horses. Washington's eyes lit up. For a brief moment, the pain receded. The mask slipped. Stuart saw the soul of the man. The farmer, the lover, E of the land. He painted furiously, capturing the noble breadth of the brow, the commanding nose, the hooded eyes heavy with responsibility. But he could not fix the mouth. He painted it exactly as it was, compressed, swollen, uncomfortable. The portrait Stuart produced, known today as the Athenaeum portrait, is unfinished. The background is raw canvas. The coat is a mere sketch. Stuart intentionally left it unfinished so he would not have to deliver it to Martha Washington, who had commissioned it. As long as it was unfinished, he could keep the original in his studio and use it as a master template to paint dozens of copies, which he sold for $100 to each. Washington loathed the image. He felt it made him look like a mewing cat or a puff-cheeked old woman. He hated the distortion of his jaw. There are whispers in history, legends, really, that Washington hated his portraits so much he wanted to burn them. While no record exists of Washington personally burning the Stuart canvas, he died in 1799 before he could have destroyed Stuart's posthumous industry. The sentiment of destruction was real. His wife, Martha, would later burn almost all of their personal correspondence after his death, a final act of privacy to protect the man from the prying eyes of history. But the portrait Washington hated, the image of his pain, would survive. It would survive his death, and 18 years later it would face a fire far more literal than his own burning disdain. August 24, 1814. The President's House, the White House, Washington City. The heat of 1814 rivaled the heat of the Monongahela. It was late August in the swampy capital of the United States. George Washington had been dead for 15 years. The nation was at war again, this time the War of 1812 against the British Empire. Inside the President's house, not yet officially called the White House, First Lady Dolley Madison waited. She was a woman of extraordinary charisma and steel, wearing a turban and clutching a spyglass. The city was emptying. The roads were clogged with wagons, cattle, and terrified civilians. The British Army, fresh from defeating Napoleon in Europe, had routed the Americans at the Battle of Bladensburg just hours earlier. The road to Washington was open. The capital was undefended. Dolley wrote a hasty letter to her sister. "Mr. Madison comes not. May God protect us. 2 messengers covered with dust come to bid me fly, but I wait for him." She was packing the most vital state secrets, the cabinet papers, the public ledgers, but her eyes kept drifting to the dining room. Hanging on the west wall was a full-length copy of Gilbert Stuart's Lansdowne portrait of George Washington. It was a massive thing, 8 feet by 5 feet, bolted securely to the plaster. To the British, Washington was the arch-traitor. To capture his image would be a supreme propaganda victory. Dolley imagined the portrait being paraded through the streets of London, mocked, or burned in a bonfire of victory. She made a decision. "Save that picture," she ordered. "If not possible, destroy it. Under no circumstances allow it to fall into the hands of the British." The burning motif returns here inverted. Washington might have wished to burn the portrait out of vanity, but Dolley was prepared to burn it out of patriotism. It was a frantic operation. Jean-Pierre Sussat, the French doorkeeper, and Thomas McGraw, the gardener, attacked the frame. Paul Jennings, a 15-year-old enslaved house servant, assisted. The screws were rusted tight. There was no time to unscrew them. "Break it," Dolley commanded. Sussat grabbed an axe, or perhaps a heavy knife, and smashed the ornate gilt frame. The wood splintered. The frame fell away, crashing to the floor. They carefully lifted the canvas, still stretched on its inner wooden stretcher, from the wall. 2 gentlemen from New York, Jacob Barker and Robert de Peyster, arrived with a wagon. They took the portrait, wrapping it in coarse linen to hide the face of the father of the country. Dolley grabbed the silver, stuffed the original Declaration of Independence into her bags, and fled the house. She was gone less than an hour when the British vanguard rode down Pennsylvania Avenue. Admiral George Cockburn and General Robert Ross entered the President's house. They found the dining table set for 40 guests, Dolley had been expecting a party. The British officers sat down, ate the food with mocking laughter. Then they piled the furniture in the center of the rooms. They took torches from the fireplace. The White House burned. The flames roared through the silk curtains, blackened the plaster ceilings, and consumed the dining room. The heat was so intense it cracked the sandstone walls of the mansion. Everything in the room was reduced to ash. Everything, that is, except the portrait. Bouncing along a dark country road in Maryland, hidden in a farm wagon, the image of the man who hated to be painted watched the glow of his burning city from the safety of the night. The man was dead, but the icon had survived its first trial by fire. 1869. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Washington, D.C. 55 years after the fire, the United States was a nation transformed. It had torn itself apart in a civil war and was slowly stitching the wounds closed. The currency had changed, too. Before the Civil War, money was a chaotic mix of private banknotes. The war had necessitated a federal currency, the greenback. In 1869, the Treasury Department authorized a new series of United States notes. These were not mere receipts for gold. They were the faith of the nation printed on paper. They needed a design that projected absolute stability, unshakable trust, and a unified history that predated the divisions of the Civil War. The designers at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing faced a choice. Who should be the face of the American dollar? They had experimented before. The first $1 bill, issued in 1862, featured Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury. It was a move of supreme vanity that was legally permissible but raised eyebrows. In 1864, a scandal erupted when Spencer Clark, the superintendent of the National Currency Bureau, put his own face on the 5-cent fractional note. Congress, outraged, passed a law in 1866 prohibiting the portraits of living persons on U.S. currency. For the 1869 redesign, the Rainbow Note series, so named for the complex red, blue, and green fibers used to deter counterfeiting, the Treasury needed a face that was beyond reproach, a face that was dead, yet immortal. They chose George Washington, and out of all the portraits available, the Peel, military hero, the Trumbull, statesman, the Houdon bust, classical, which one did they choose? They chose the Athenaeum portrait. They chose the unfinished study by Gilbert Stuart. They chose the image of the 64-year-old man in the velvet chair, clenching his jaw against the pane of hippopotamus ivory and gold springs. Why? Because by 1869, that image was Washington. Stuart's strategy of keeping the original unfinished and selling copies had worked too well. The image had proliferated into thousands of engravings, schoolbooks, and parlor lithographs. It was the official face. It possessed a gravity, a Roman Republican dignity that suited the Victorian era's taste for gravitas. The engravers at the Bureau took Stuart's canvas and translated it into steel. They sharpened the lines. They deepened the shadows. They surrounded his head with intricate lathwork and scroll patterns, turning the painting into a security document. The irony is profound and tragic. Washington was a man of immense physical pride. He was a surveyor who walked the woods, a dancer who could minuet for hours, a horseman who could break the wildest stallion. He was obsessed with his appearance, ordering his coats from London to fit his specific measurements. He hated his dental disability with a burning passion, seeing it as a sign of decay and weakness. Yet the image that grants him immortality is the specific record of his greatest physical insecurity: the bulge. The slight distension of the lower face on the $1 bill is the physical displacement caused by the dentures. The expression, the stern, tight-lipped look, is not merely the weight of command. It is the muscular effort required to keep the spring-loaded jaws from snapping open. When you look at a $1 bill today, you are not looking at a man at peace. You are looking at a man in pain. You are looking at a man holding his breath. This design choice in 1869 cemented the image. While the borders and the back of the bill would change, the modern web design appearing in the 1920s, the portrait remained Stuart's. Today, there are nearly 13 billion $1 bills in circulation. It is the most reproduced image in human history. The man who wanted to destroy the image because it showed his weakness is now defined by it. The portrait he hated is the object most coveted by the world. July 14, 1755. The Great Meadows, Western Pennsylvania. We return to the darkness of 1755. The flash forward to the dollar bill fades, and we are back in the mud and blood of the Monongahela retreat. The battle is over. The British Army has been routed. Washington, the 23-year-old survivor, stands in the middle of the road. General Braddock is dead. He died of his wounds during the retreat, muttering in his delirium, "Who would have thought it?" and "We shall know better how to deal with them another time." But there would be no other time for Braddock. Washington stood over the body. It was night. The remnants of the army were terrified that the pursuing indigenous warriors would find the general's body. A British general's scalp would be a trophy of immense value. Washington made a decision that was both practical and gruesome. "Dig," he ordered. Soldiers dug a trench right in the middle of the road. It was shallow, hasty work in the light of a hooded lantern. Washington wrapped the general in his bloody silk sash and lowered him into the earth. There was no chaplain to read the service, so Washington stood by the grave, opening his prayer book. He read the Anglican burial service in a low, steady voice, the words swallowed by the vast, indifferent forest. "Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up, and is cut down, like a flower." When the grave was filled, Washington did not mark it with a cross or a stone. Instead, he gave an order that seemed cruel, but was necessary to protect the dead. "March the wagons over it." He ordered the entire train, the remaining artillery, the wagons, the hundreds of tramping feet, to march directly over the fresh earth. They trampled the ground until it was packed hard, indistinguishable from the rest of the road. They obliterated the resting place of Edward Braddock, hiding him forever beneath the very road he had built to conquer the wilderness. Washington watched the wagons roll over the grave, his face a mask of stone. He was 23, and he had learned a lesson that would define the rest of his life. Dignity is a luxury. Survival is a ruthless business. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the torn fabric where the 4 bullets had passed through. He thought of the 2 horses dead on the field. Years later, a tribal chief who had fought at the Monongahela would meet Washington. He would tell him that he and his braves had singled out the tall officer on the white horse. They had fired at him repeatedly. They were marksmen who never missed. "We aimed at you," the chief would say, "but our bullets turned aside. You cannot be killed in battle." He only knew that he was alive. As he rode away from the grave of his mentor, leaving the British Empire's arrogance buried in the mud, George Washington began to understand the nature of his existence. He was not just a man anymore. He was becoming a vessel for something larger. He had survived the wilderness trap. He would survive the smallpox. He would survive the plots of the Continental Congress, the freezing winter of Valley Forge, and the cabals of his own generals. He would survive the dental agony that plagued his every waking moment. He was being forged into an icon. The fire that destroyed Braddock's army had missed him. The bullets had missed him. And decades later, the fire that burned the White House would miss him too.